hear loud, incessant knocking upon your door.
Feel overwhelming fear while confronting the eerie children standing outside.
See their eyes, a complete and solid black.
All this and more weird history, strange science, and the paranormal.
It comes out of nowhere.
It wants to come in.
It's this week's Dark Decanter of Odd Tonic.
Welcome to the parlor. I'm Jennifer.
And I'm Maxwell. Have a seat, dear guest. You are a brave soul, aren't you?
See, love, I told you they'd come back. Our guest is of a hearty and twisted stock, like us.
You are right, as always, love. As we continue our countdown to Halloween, we have kicked up the creepy with true stories of phone calls from the dead and tales of childhoods spent within haunted houses. And through it all, you, dear guest, have never wavered. But we wonder, will that be tested?
Because tonight, we're exploring a phenomena in which an ordinary moment turns unnervingly grotesque, then hideously foreign. A realm where the boundaries between fiction, folklore, and a very real rapping on your window at night all become inextricably and disturbingly blurred. Shut the door, lock it tight, draw the blinds and avoid eye contact at all costs, for that scary but harmless urban legend you've heard about is completely and dangerously real.
Paul was not a small man. He stood around 6'3" and looked like a linebacker. He had been in the service when he was young, then worked for years as a prison guard. He arrived home from work one evening after a day shift at the prison. He changed out of his uniform and went to the kitchen to prepare a sandwich. Since his wife and son were out of town for a few days, Paul had the house to himself. He decided to relax, have a couple of beers, and watch some sports before turning in for the night. Standing in the kitchen, he heard a knock at the front door. At first, I wasn't even sure it was a knock, said Paul. It was kind of soft and continuous, and I thought maybe it was just some other noise from outside. I kept making my food and ignored it for a few minutes. Then it got louder, and I knew it must be someone knocking at the front door. It was odd, he thought, that the person didn't ring the doorbell. Paul left his food on the counter and approached the front door. He looked out one of the small side panel windows in the door's frame and saw two young boys on the porch. He guessed from their size they were between 12 and 14 years old. Paul opened the door and looked at the kids. They were dressed in similar fashion, both wearing hoodies and jeans. One boy's top was gray and the other was dark brown. The boy in brown stood slightly behind the boy in the gray hoodie, and they both held their heads tilted downward, saying nothing. Paul broke the silence. "Can I help you?" he asked. He expected a sales pitch. Perhaps the kids were fundraising for school or selling magazines. The lead boy in gray kind of smiled and replied, "Hey, we just wanted to come in for a bit." Paul was puzzled by the odd reply. "Do I know you guys? I think maybe you've got the wrong house." The boys didn't react to Paul's comment. After a moment, the lead boy spoke again. "Oh well, it's getting kind of late. Can we come in for a bit?" Something was causing the hair on the back of my neck to go up, Paul recalled. I felt like this kid was ignoring me, and focusing on me all at the same time. It just made no sense. With his internal alarms going off, Paul began to look at the kids even more closely. It was early evening and the porch light was on, so he shifted his stance to get a better look at their faces. It was then that Paul realized with a shock that the boys' eyes were solid black. The lead boy looked up directly at Paul and spoke again. This time, his voice was more insistent. "It would be good if you just let us come in now. You don't have to think about it. Just open the door some and let us in." Paul felt rooted to the spot. His brain was trying to process what was happening. I didn't feel like I could move. I was a little dizzy and had kind of a numb feeling. I started thinking that maybe I should just let them in. After all, they were only a couple of kids. Paul wasn't sure how long he stood there. He felt locked in the moment, trying to make his body move. The same boy spoke once more. "It's okay. This won't take long." That comment jerked me into action, Paul stated. All of a sudden, I felt my fight or flight response kick in, and it got me moving. He slammed the door shut, shouting at the boys to get off his porch. Last thing I saw as I was slamming the door were those two boys looking at me. Two sets of those creepy, solid black eyes just boring a hole in me. With the door closed, Paul leaned against it. "I felt like I had to hold it shut," he said. He locked the deadbolt and stood quietly, trying to calm himself. His adrenaline was still rushing, and he felt short of breath. Then came the knock. It was a long, steady knock on the door. Soft at first, just like I had heard to begin with. Those boys still wanted in. I realized I had been squeezing my eyes shut. I opened them and looked around the room. It's like I just didn't know what to do. I think I fought the urge to run at that point. My brain was telling me it was my house and I wasn't running from kids. But another part of me just wanted to hide. Paul turned and slowly backed away from the front door. He stopped part way across the room and stood looking at the entrance to his home. The knocking stopped. Paul felt a cold chill come over him. There, staring through the side panel window, was the face of one of the boys, his black eyes looking into the living room, staring straight at Paul. They made eye contact, and the boy raised a hand, tapping on the glass as he peered inside. Paul took a deep breath, feeling his anger rise. I had had enough. No one was going to invade my home or make me feel afraid like that. I ran into the bedroom and retrieved my pistol from the nightstand. I was determined to scare these punks off my property. Paul put a clip in his gun and rushed back to the living room. He flung the front door open and stepped out on the porch. They were nowhere in sight. Paul couldn't sleep that night. He walked the house constantly, checking the doors and windows. Even years after the incident, he still felt haunted by it. It's those eyes. I've never been able to really get them out of my head. I've had gang members and hardened criminals get in my face and try to bully me. I've been threatened with guns, knives, and every kind of nasty act you can think of, and it never fazed me. Then a pair of weird kids show up, and they have me shaking. I just don't understand it. Sometimes I'll have dreams about them. I'll wake up in a sweat, thinking that there was a knock at the door. I don't think it will ever totally leave me.
This account is from the book The Black-Eyed Children by paranormal investigator and author David Weatherly. Now in its second edition, the book chronicles terrible, true encounters with these unearthly urchins. But before we continue, a little background. If you have heard of the Black-Eyed Kids, or BEKs or BECs, you may likely tie them to internet-born creepypasta-type fictions like Slender Man or Eyeless Jack, because in 1998, writer Brian Bethel posted in a paranormal community forum a very real and harrowing personal experience with Black-Eyed Kids, not unlike Paul's. Until this point, BEK accounts remained on the fringes of paranormal reporting and were largely unknown to the mainstream. Readers deeply resonated with Bethel's story, and it went viral, inspiring many others to post their professed encounters, real and otherwise. The momentum continues to this day, to the point that the Black-Eyed Kids are considered by most to be merely an internet trope. This is wishful thinking.
Paranormal investigators like Nick Redfern and David Weatherly have researched BEK reports going as far back as 1923 at least. Though the accounts can differ slightly, the patterns remain consistent.
They tend to strike when you are alone, knocking on your door or windows, most often at night.
When the door is answered, one or more children, somewhere between 6 and 16 years of age, stand motionless and silent, their heads frequently nodded downward.
They are often pale and wear clothing that's sometimes unassuming, sometimes worn and ill-fitting, or even from a bygone era.
The children are not openly threatening, but they exude an overwhelming aura of malevolence, and you are immediately gripped by a paralyzing fear as they quietly, adamantly ask to be let in.
Their black eyes cast a hypnotic spell, rendering you unable to think clearly, rooting you to the spot. You may witness your body acting without your permission, stepping aside and letting them enter.
But to what end? What is it that these ghoulish beings want? The answer to that question becomes horrifically apparent in our next story from author Nick Redfern.
As a truck driver, Martin had been on the road for 2 weeks and was looking forward to a few days of relaxation. On his first night back, Martin planned on watching a bunch of shows he had recorded while he was away. He made himself a big sandwich, cracked open a cold beer, and watched his shows. Around 8:30 p.m., there was a knock on the door. Martin didn't even bother looking through the spy hole. He assumed it was his immediate neighbor Rex, who had taken any packages from UPS or FedEx that might have been left on Martin's doorstep while he was away. Martin got the shock of his life when he was confronted by a boy and a girl, both around 11 or 12 years of age, with large, black, eerie-looking eyes. The girl was dressed in jeans and a long-sleeved black top, while the boy had a black hoodie. Both looked sickly and scrawny, as if they needed a meal in them. They stood together, hand in hand, looking at Martin with expressions on their faces that were lacking in emotion, while giving off an air of highly charged malevolence. The girl said they were homeless and needed something to eat. It all seemed very much like a ruse, as if they had spoken the words time and time again. Most disturbing of all, for a few moments Martin felt transfixed, almost hypnotized, by those large, black eyes. He could not understand why he didn't quickly shut the door. Martin could only say it was if he was somehow prevented. The girl repeated, "We need to eat. May we come in?" Martin recalls inviting them in. It felt like I said it in a dream. The next thing he remembers is seeing the pair standing in front of him while he sat on his living room couch, not knowing how he had gotten there. The girl said just one word, "Eat." At that point, Martin felt deathly ill. It was as if he hadn't eaten in days. The pair stared intently at Martin, who found himself getting weaker and weaker and weaker still. Martin found himself barely able to move. He simply did not have the energy to even stand up. It was, Martin said, as if he himself was being eaten alive by the ghoulish things in his midst. After a few minutes, both the girl and the boy turned and left, still holding hands. Martin finally managed to crawl to his bedroom, where he lapsed into a deep sleep. He did not wake until well into the following afternoon. For the next 3 or 4 days, the overwhelming weakness, made worse by bouts of dizziness and a bad taste in his mouth, kept him in his bed. It was almost a week later when he finally felt fully back to normal. While Martin has no idea what the children were, he believes they were not human.
Martin's account can be found in Nick Redfern's rather aptly named book, Paranormal Parasites, The Voracious Appetites of Soul-Sucking Supernatural Entities. In it are many similar reports, and the BEK's intent begins to come into focus. It is suggested that the BEKs, using some sort of psychokinesis, are manipulating minds in order to secure an invitation, one that allows them to enter your domain and feast upon your life force.
However, such is the pattern of the paranormal. Just when you think you're gaining an answer, it becomes buried in more questions. Other eyewitness accounts have identified that these black-eyed beings can also appear as adult men and women, and when they stand menacingly before our eyes, they may, in reality, be inside our minds. Here's an account from G. Michael Vassey's book, The Chilling True Terror of the Black-Eyed Kids.
I took my family on vacation last year. We stayed at a motel near Lake Country, California. It's a nice area with plenty of things for the kids to do. Everything had been going well, and on our 4th night we were in our room watching TV when someone knocked on the door. We weren't expecting any visitors, so I just elected to simply ignore it. The knocking continued, and whatever it was on the other side of the door started growling. I shouted out that they had the wrong room and that we weren't expecting anyone. The knocking ceased. A few moments later, it started again, and a voice started shouting, "Let me in." It was a female voice, but devoid of any emotion. Then we started to hear the same thing happening up and down all along the corridor. Multiple voices all screaming, "Let me in! Let me in! Let me in!" We were terrified, wondering just what was going on. I got up and looked out the window. A woman and a man were walking into the building. Both looked normal until one of them noticed that I was standing at the window. I saw her eyes. They were completely black. When the commotion finally died down, I ventured out of our room and went over to the reception desk. The receptionist told me that she had received no complaints and that she had been on duty the whole time. She had no explanation for what I was telling her. I think she actually thought I was insane. I just wonder, what would have happened if I had opened the door? Would I still be here to tell this story?
A fine question indeed, dear guest. If only we had some idea of what we are truly dealing with. Well, if you come from an Asian cultural heritage, you likely already have an answer and are well versed in the realities and perils of the hungry ghosts.
When we return, we're going to travel to China, with money to burn during the Hungry Ghost Festival, and we'll share some more unsettling stories of black-eyed kids, tales that will keep you from signing for packages until the end of your days.
You're listening to Odd Tonic. We'll be right back. You'll know it's us by the doorbell.
You may recall our episode on superstitions, mirrors, and scrying a while back.
It's one of my favorites.
A couple of our spooky mirror game examples were inspired and sourced from a brilliant and spooky website called theghostinmymachine.com. Its evil mastermind is author Lucia Peters, and we are excited to share with you that she has a brand new book. It brims cover to cover with more eerie midnight diversions, from century-old classics like Light as a Feather, Stiff as a Board, to modern internet-born challenges such as the duplicitous Answer Man.
And we love it.
Yes, we do. It's called Dangerous Games to Play in the Dark, a guide to summoning spirits, divining the future, and invoking the supernatural. With a title like that, how can you not already love it? It's published by Chronicle Books and is available now, just in time for Halloween.
Dark things come in small packages, and this little book is darkly delicious.
Yes.
Lucia creates magic, capturing the rules of each game to play and what the rewards and consequences will be for doing so. You feel a little wicked just reading the words as you turn each page to see what happens next.
Dare to light a candle and try a game or two, if you must. But just perusing these often treacherous sounding games is a delightfully scary treat in itself. I truly feel it's a must-have for all Bloody Mary sleepover survivors and connoisseurs of the creepy.
Dangerous Games to Play in the Dark, a guide to summoning spirits, divining the future, and invoking the supernatural by Lucia Peters. It's available everywhere fine and spooky books are sold. Look for a link in our show notes.
Jennifer, my love, look, we still haven't scared off our dear guest. That makes us so happy. We are so very glad that you're here with us.
And sharing the spooky and strange is all the more special this time of year. It's our first Halloween together.
And it has been dark and magical, hasn't it?
Oh, I never want it to end.
And it won't, because Odd Tonic will be here long after the jack-o'-lanterns have been blown out. Join us every week in the parlor for
weird history, strange science, and the paranormal.
Exactly. And keep the weird vibe going by joining us online on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram, all at Odd Tonic Society.
And share your own weird and unexplainable experiences by emailing us at theparlor@oddtonicsociety.com. We may share them on a future Parlor Stories episode. But for now, let's head back for more bizarre and baleful tales of black-eyed children.
Welcome back. We have been exploring the seriously sinister realm of black-eyed entities, specifically those in the form of children who rap upon the door of homes and vehicles, insisting to be invited in, leaving those unfortunate enough to cross them weakened, depleted, and ill.
However, if you live in or are from an Asian country, all of this strangeness would sound rather familiar, because it's culturally understood that the endless wandering of vengeful and insatiable spirits are a very real threat to the living.
In his book, The Black-Eyed Children, author David Weatherly takes us to China to explore some of their cultural and religious traditions. In general terms, he says, it is believed that everyone becomes a ghost once they pass from the world of the living. Eventually, a person's ghost weakens and completely releases all ties to the physical world, then dies a second time before finally moving on to, hopefully, higher realms of the afterlife. Some spirits, however, become stuck in an in-between space and move into the realm of the hungry ghost. The primary reason one becomes trapped has to do with the life they led while they were living. Negative behavior has a direct influence on the afterlife, and one's actions can dictate what happens after death. Anger, greed, jealousy, and ignorance are all factors that can cause someone to become a hungry ghost. It is a cursed existence, with the spirit forever driven by intense desires, although nothing can bring satisfaction. He goes on to describe an annual celebration called the Hungry Ghost Festival. The festival is held every year during the 7th month of the Chinese calendar, during the full moon. According to tradition, the gates of hell are open during this time, and the hungry ghosts are free to roam the land. The spirits wander looking for food, entertainment, and anything else that will fulfill their desires. Public celebrations are held to entertain the hungry ghosts. Seats in the front rows are left empty so the spirits have a place of honor to sit. Food is prepared and left out on altars. Celebrants burn joss paper, a thin tissue-like paper in shapes of houses, cars, and other objects of desire. They also burn large quantities of joss paper hell money, which is considered valid currency in the underworld, and by burning it, hungry ghosts are given the currency to use as they wish. Weatherly includes a story told by Jill, a woman of Chinese descent now living in America.
The black-eyed children, she says, are spirits from the realm of the hungry ghost. My sister saw one of them at our parents' home. She came home from the market one day. She still lived with our parents in Shanghai. She made some tea and was doing things in the kitchen, preparing food for dinner. There was a knock at the window of the kitchen, and she looked over to see a girl standing there outside. It was warm and the window was half open to let the air in. My sister walked over to the window and looked at the girl. Right away, she saw that the little girl had black eyes and that her skin was very white and pale. My sister asked the girl what she wanted, and the girl told her, "I want to eat. I want you to invite me in so I can have some of your food." My sister was very afraid. She thought the girl was some kind of spirit. She told me the girl looked strange and didn't appear to be completely solid. She left the kitchen and called out to our father, who was resting. She told him about the girl and what she had said. My father went into the kitchen, but there was no sign of the little girl. He closed the window and the curtains, and then said they should all do prayers because my sister had seen a wandering spirit. Jill's family spoke with both a Buddhist and a Taoist priest. The house was blessed and rituals were done to cleanse the home, the family, and to help the wandering spirit find peace. The family firmly believes that had the spirit been allowed into the home, great misfortune would have befallen them all.
Could Jill be right, dear guest? Did the Chinese solve the mystery of the black-eyed kids thousands of years ago?
Let's listen to more accounts of people's brushes with BEKs and assess. This one comes from a Marine in the U.S. Air Force and is taken from The Chilling True Terror of the Black-Eyed Kids by G. Michael Vassy.
I was on base one weekend. Almost everyone else was home, drinking, sleeping, or on duty. I had only stayed that weekend because I had spent all my money. I was on my bunk watching a movie when I heard a knock at my door. I thought it was my roommate. I went and opened it. I found 2 kids standing on the walkway. Only these kids freaked the heck out of me. I don't know what it was about them, but we're always told to listen to what's inside because it just might save your life. Well, right then, that voice was screaming at me to shut the door and lock those kids out. There was also the little telltale sign that these kids had pitch black eyes. I mean, there was absolutely no white or any other color to them whatsoever, just pure black. I asked them what they were doing here at this time of night. One of them told me that it was cold out and they wanted to come in and read. I had never met a kid that wanted to come in and read, and I knew for a fact they did not belong on this base. They didn't mention any parents, any broken down cars, or even how they had managed to get this far out to the base. There was nothing sincere about these kids. They were playing a game. It was at this point when I noticed I could not drag my eyes away from theirs. It was like I was being sucked in. I felt absolutely horrendous, as though my life were being dragged from my body, screaming. They just stood there with their mouths closed, their eyes staring into mine, and no emotion at all. I prayed for someone else to come by. I glanced around, and the kid stepped forward, and I stepped back and slammed the door shut. I felt as though I was in grave danger. Every warning bell was going off in my head. I stepped back and fell on my bunk, drained of energy. I heard soft knocking against the door for a few minutes, shuffling feet, and then nothing. The next morning I went down and asked one of the officers on duty if he had seen the kids. He hadn't. How did they get in? Where did they go? I have no idea. But if they can get into a military campus, they can get anywhere.
Being able to pop in and out of secure areas, that would certainly be easy for a ghost, one would think.
Let's go back to David Weatherly's The Black-Eyed Kids, where we find Jenny working the closing shift at a gas station outside of Phoenix, Arizona in 2009.
I was in the back room behind the registers doing my paperwork, and there was a knock on the front glass doors. The knocking wouldn't stop. It was also weird because it had a constant rapping, a long, drawn-out knock, knock, knock. I decided to turn some of the lights off, hoping that would make the person go away. That knocking kept on, though. Finally, I got up and headed for the door, planning to yell at the person that we were closed and tell them to just leave. When I got around the counter, I saw two kids standing at the glass doors. My first thought was that their parents must be out pumping gas, but when I looked in the lot, there weren't any cars and there was no one else in sight. In a loud voice, I asked, "Where are your parents?" The kids just stood there looking at me, but didn't answer. They were standing about an arm's length from the doors, and I thought the whole thing was a bit strange. There were two of them, and their clothes looked a bit worn. They were wearing hoodies, but I thought something looked unusual about their clothes. It's like the clothes didn't quite fit them right. I turned the lock and opened the door enough to get my head out. "Are you kids lost? Do you need help? Can I call someone to pick you up?" They just stood there, and one said, "We want to come in and shop." As soon as this boy spoke, I got a really bad feeling in my stomach. All of a sudden, I was afraid of what was going on. I looked around the lot again, hoping to see some other people, but no one was there. I looked back at the kids, and it seemed like they were closer to me now. It was the weirdest thing because I should have seen them move, even with my head turned some. I wanted to close the door so bad, but for some odd reason, I was having a hard time making myself do it. It seemed like I stood there thinking about closing the door, trying to push it shut and lock it, but at the same time, part of me was refusing my brain order to close the door. I felt stuck. I told the kids that we were closed, and I asked again where their parents were. They just ignored my question, and the same voice spoke again. "Invite us into the shop. We know you can." Each time he said the word shop, it had a hard sound. It was like a kid who just learned a new word and wanted to keep practicing. He repeated the same thing again. Right then, I looked at the boy. I realized his eyes were completely dark. There was no white in them. Every bit of those eyes were black. So black, in fact, they had a shine from the lights. I didn't hesitate anymore. I closed the door as quick as I could and ran back to get my phone. I got my boyfriend on the phone and I told him to get over as quick as he could because there were these two creepy boys hanging around outside the store. He was already on his way, so he said he'd be there in 4 minutes. He told me to call the police if I was worried. Just as I hung up the phone, I heard the knocking on the glass start again. I don't know why I was so shaken up, but I felt terrified. I went to the back and turned down all the additional lights in the store. Then, I turned the music up loud, trying to drown out the sound of that knocking. After a few minutes, I glanced over at the doors. The two boys were standing there, side by side, staring into the store. Even though I was standing behind shelves, I felt like they were staring directly at me and knew where I was. I called my boyfriend again and kept him on the phone until he pulled into the parking lot. He got out of his truck and was walking around the parking lot, but there was no sign of those kids. I've never been so shaken up in my life. I didn't even finish counting the money and doing the paperwork that night. I put everything in the safe and decided to just go in early the next morning to take care of it. Jenny's encounter had lingering effects. She ended up taking time off work to recover. For weeks afterward, she had stomach issues and couldn't eat. Everything she tried to eat had a sour taste to it. If someone was cooking, she couldn't stand the smell. And it wasn't only the food. She constantly thought there was something rotting around the house, but no one else could smell it. She even made her boyfriend crawl under the house because she thought some animal had gotten under there and died, but he couldn't find anything. And the worst part was the dreams. She would dream about those kids. For a while, it was every night in a row. So much so, she would try to keep herself up, watching television until she fell asleep on the sofa. In the dreams, those kids would show up at my house, knocking on the door and telling me to let them in. Sometimes I would dream they were staring in the window. I'd be standing at the kitchen sink and I'd look up and see them staring at me with those creepy black eyes.
I would definitely consider that a terrible misfortune, perhaps the kind that Jill and her family feared would have befallen them had they not been ritually cleansed. Maybe we're getting somewhere in this investigation, dear guest.
Let's listen to one more account from Nick Redfern's Paranormal Parasites.
Marie worked irregular hours at her job. As a result, one Saturday night, shortly after 11 p.m., she was stretched out on her couch in front of the TV after a 10-hour stint at work. She had gotten herself a pizza and a couple of cans of Coors Light. All was good. Marie practically flew off the couch with fear as there was a loud knock on the front door of her second-floor apartment. She thought, who could that be at this time of night? Marie carefully and silently crept to the door and looked through the spy hole, her breathing already slightly labored. There were two boys staring back at her, both wearing black hoodies. She asked if they were okay. No reply. Marie put the chain on the door and then opened it the couple of inches that the chain would allow. One thing immediately struck Marie and filled her with fear. Their skin was as white as paper. One of them, in a monotone and blank fashion, demanded food. Not surprisingly, Marie slammed the door and ran to the furthest wall in the living room. Her mind was in a whirlwind of confusion and fear. After a few minutes, she again crept to the door and looked through the spy hole. The boys were still there. Most disturbing of all, the pair clearly reacted when Marie looked at them, even though she had done so in complete silence. Then, something even more terrifying happened. The pair of children suddenly shimmered like a heat wave, said Marie, and transformed into a pair of bipedal, lizard-like monsters. In seconds, they were swallowed up by a sudden black nothingness outside the door and were gone. Marie fled her apartment and went to stay with her mother in nearby Ohio for the next 3 days. Notably, for those 3 days, Marie felt exhausted, as if she had the flu.
Well, then again, dear guest, maybe they aren't ghosts. What do you think, my love?
I don't even know where to begin. You know, I keep thinking about the BEK's insistence on the invitation. On the surface, it looks like a physical request, but I wonder, is it subconsciously symbolic? When we invite someone into our home, our car, anything that is our physical sanctuary, do we also, on a subconscious level, also invite them into our inner sanctuary? The BEKs seem to be working on an advanced level of consciousness, judging by the way they're able to manipulate our minds, and by the way they seem to have an awareness of us looking at them, even though they can't see us. So maybe the access they are truly seeking is in our heads or our hearts.
And it's easy to be distracted by the physical facts of these stories, the eyes, the monotone voice, the sudden vanishing of these creepy visitors. But you're right, the real scary encounter in these tales are the psychic traps they're trying to get you in.
Right.
It's such a subtle game.
Yeah.
How many people would say yes just to not create a seemingly embarrassing situation? You know, we don't like to say no. And also just be thrown because they're children.
Right.
I'm really glad that people are still listening to their internal alarms, even if they think logically there's nothing to be afraid of, because clearly there is.
And speaking of that, I've been thinking a lot about the fear that you feel, that really intense, more than seems appropriate fear that people experience during these encounters. This hyper fear state is as you know, found throughout many types of paranormal experiences. And it is theorized that some of these entities actually cause and feast on this fear energy. So what do you think? Do you think that the fear experienced in a BEK sighting is the same thing?
Or is the fear merely our body's natural reaction when faced with a predator that may not even be of this earth?
Well, you know, I'm really glad that you asked that, because I have discovered the definitive answer, not only for that, but for everything that involves the mystery of the black-eyed kids. Unfortunately, we've run out of time, so we're going to have to wrap up this edition of Odd Tonic.
Remember to subscribe so you never miss a show, and leave us an iTunes review so other brave, scare-loving souls can find us too. And
don't forget to share your own true BEK or other unexplainable experience with us by emailing us at theparlor@oddtonicsociety.com. We just may share it on a future episode.
And if you haven't done so, check out our YouTube channel with visually enhanced versions of these episodes. We'll be back next week with more weird history, strange science, and paranormal peculiarities.
This is, dear guest, goodbye for now. But remember, if, late in the night, you are startled awake by a loud knocking upon your front door, and with the hair rising on the back of your neck, you spy through the peephole 2 looming shapes silhouetted by moonlight as they knock, knock, knock. Don't worry.
It's just us.
Good night.